Imagine this. You are scrolling through your favorite social media feed when suddenly you see a headline that makes you nod and go, "See, I knew it." Maybe it is about your favorite celebrity being awesome again. Or maybe it is another article proving that pineapple really does belong on pizza. So, naturally, you click it, read it, like it, share it, and feel just a little more smug about your worldview. But here is the funny thing. The moment you saw something that agreed with what you already believed, you trusted it without even thinking twice. But if that same article had said the opposite, you might have rolled your eyes, kept scrolling, or even gotten annoyed. That, right there, is a perfect little trap our brains fall into all the time, and it is called confirmation bias. Now, before we dive too deep, let us take a step back. Think about a time you were having a debate with someone, maybe about politics or health advice, or whether that movie everyone loves is actually overrated. And have you ever noticed how we tend to Google things that support our side? Like if you believe eating eggs is good for you, you will type why eggs are healthy, not are eggs bad for you. We are not really searching for truth. We are searching for backup, for allies, for digital high fives. That is confirmation bias in action, and we all do it. No one is immune, not even the smartest people you know. So what is confirmation bias, really? In simple terms, it is our brain's tendency to notice, remember, and believe information that confirms what we already think. At the same time, we tend to ignore, forget, or even argue against anything that challenges our existing beliefs. Our brain loves to be right. It feels comfortable, safe, and even a little powerful. But being comfortable is not always the same as being correct. This bias sneaks into so many parts of our lives. It shapes how we see the news, how we form opinions, and even how we remember events. Ever had an argument with someone where both of you remember the exact same situation totally differently? You remember them yelling first. They swear it was you. Who is right? Maybe both of you are just remembering the parts that fit your own narrative. And here is the twist. Confirmation bias is not just about being wrong. It is about staying wrong. It stops us from learning, from growing, from changing our minds when we probably should. That is why understanding it matters. Because if we are not careful, this bias can lead us to make poor decisions, judge people unfairly, and stay stuck in beliefs that no longer serve us. Now let us bring in a real-world example to really drive this home. In the 1960s, a psychologist named Peter Wason did a clever little experiment. He gave people a number sequence, 2, 4, 6. Then he asked them to figure out the rule behind the pattern. People could test different numbers, and he would tell them if those numbers followed the rule. The funny thing is, most people only tested numbers that fit their guess. Like if they thought the rule was go up by 2, they would try numbers like 8 and 10, 12. And when the experimenter said yes, they felt proud and confident. But they rarely tested numbers that might disprove their theory, like trying 7, 9, 11. And so they never realized that the real rule was simply any 3 increasing numbers. Most people failed the test, not because they were not smart, but because they were so busy looking for confirmation that they never thought to challenge themselves. This happens in the real world more than we like to admit. In relationships, we might only notice the moments that confirm someone does not care, and ignore all the little ways they actually do. In business, we might keep investing in a bad idea because we are so attached to the times it seemed to work. In science, politics, education, even sports, confirmation bias quietly influences who we trust, what we believe, and what we dismiss. And here is the sneaky part. Confirmation bias often feels like confidence, like certainty, like clarity. But in reality, it is just your brain filtering the world through a lens that says, I already know what is true. That is a pretty dangerous pair of glasses to wear if you want to see clearly. So, what can we do about it? Honestly, just knowing about confirmation bias is a huge first step. The moment you start catching yourself looking for only the yes men in your thinking, you are already ahead of the game. Ask yourself, What would prove me wrong? And really sit with that. Read things you disagree with, not to get mad, but to get curious. Talk to people who think differently, not to win, but to understand. And when you are wrong, because hey, we all are, sometimes be brave enough to admit it. Confirmation bias is not evil. It is just your brain trying to protect you from confusion. But sometimes, a little confusion is exactly what we need. Because in that moment of doubt, we grow, we see more, we think deeper. So the next time you are scrolling, reading, or arguing, remember, your brain might be whispering, "See, I was right." But the real power comes when you say, maybe I was not. That is where learning begins. You walk into a store to buy a new jacket. Right there at the entrance is a bold red sign that says, "Was $150, now only $70. Instantly, your brain lights up like a Christmas tree. That jacket might not even be your style. It might not even be that warm, but the fact that it used to cost so much more makes it feel like a steal. You try it on, glance at yourself in the mirror, and tell yourself, well, it is a huge discount. You walk out of the store, bag in hand, jacket on your arm, and maybe, just maybe, a tiny voice in the back of your head wonders if you really needed that jacket at all. Sound familiar? We've all been there. Whether it's shopping, negotiating, or even choosing a college major, there's this little brain glitch that sneaks into our decisions. It's sneaky because it feels like we're being logical. We think we're analyzing, comparing, and weighing options. But in reality, our first impression, that very first piece of information we saw, might be calling all the shots without us even realizing it. This sneaky mental shortcut is called the anchoring bias. Anchoring bias happens when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, even if that information is random or irrelevant. That first number, that first opinion, or that first impression becomes our anchor, and it shapes the way we think about everything that comes after. Let's say you're selling your old phone online. If you see someone else listing a similar phone for $500, you might feel like you can ask for the same, or maybe a little less. But what if the first listing you saw was only $300? Suddenly, $500 feels way too high. Even though your phone didn't magically change in value, the anchor set your expectations, and now everything is being measured against it. The funny thing is, this doesn't just happen with shopping. It affects almost every part of our lives. From salary negotiations to guessing someone's age, or even deciding what's normal in a conversation. Anchoring shapes our judgment without us even noticing. Here's a great example from psychology that really shows how powerful this bias can be. In a study by researchers Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, people were asked to spin a wheel that had numbers from 0 to 100, but the wheel was secretly rigged to land only on 10 or 65. After spinning, participants were asked, what percentage of African countries are members of the United Nations? Now, the number on the wheel had nothing to do with Africa, geography, or the United Nations. But people who got the number 10 guessed much lower percentages, and people who got 65 guessed much higher. Why? Because that number they just saw, even though it was random, got stuck in their minds. It became the anchor. Even more surprising, this happens in serious situations. Judges have been found to give harsher prison sentences if they are first exposed to a higher number, even if that number comes from something irrelevant, like a prosecutor casually suggesting a sentence. Real estate agents have valued houses differently based on the listing price, even though they were all given the same information about the house. Anchoring shows up in our first impressions of people, in job interviews, in classroom grading, and even in online dating. Think about how it works in everyday life. If someone tells you a product usually costs $100 but is now on sale for $60, you feel like you're getting a deal. But if they just said, here's a product, it costs $60, your brain might react completely differently. The original price becomes the anchor, even if it's made up. Or imagine you're at a job interview and the company asks you what salary you expect. You throw out a number that feels fair. That number becomes the anchor. Even if it turns out they were willing to pay more, the negotiation now circles around the figure you set. The anchoring bias is powerful because it's automatic. We can't really turn it off, but we can learn to spot it. When you realize your brain is latching onto the first piece of information, that's your chance to pause. Take a step back. Ask yourself, wait, am I thinking clearly, or am I just stuck to that first number? One way to fight it is to do your research before making a decision. If you're buying something, compare prices from multiple places. If you're applying for a job, check typical salary ranges in your field. The more informed you are, the less likely you are to be pulled around by the first anchor that appears. Another trick is to deliberately consider alternatives. Ask yourself what you would think if the situation were flipped. What if the item had never been on sale? What if the suggestion came later instead of first? These questions help loosen the grip of that anchor. So, the next time you see something marked down, or you catch yourself adjusting your opinion just because of how something was first framed, remember, your brain might be anchoring you, but you don't have to sync with it. Imagine sitting at home, scrolling through your phone late at night, and you stumble upon a news article about a plane crash. It is dramatic, terrifying, and the headline practically screams at you. You read the whole thing, watch the video, and now your stomach is in knots. The very next day, someone invites you on a trip, and guess what? It involves a flight. Suddenly you feel uneasy. You hesitate. You start thinking, maybe I should just stay home. Planes are dangerous, right? What if the same thing happens to me? Now pause for a second. What just happened there? You did not suddenly become a professional risk analyst overnight. You did not look up airline safety statistics or compare risks. You just felt like planes were dangerous. And that feeling came from one vivid story. One emotional moment that stuck in your brain. Welcome to the world of the availability heuristic. So what exactly is the availability heuristic? Well, it is basically your brain's shortcut for estimating how likely something is based on how easily you can remember examples of it. If something pops into your head quickly and clearly, your brain assumes it must be common or likely to happen again. It is like your brain saying, hey, I can think of an example of that really fast, so it must be a big deal. And just like that, your judgment gets a little twisted. This happens all the time and in ways we hardly notice. Let's say your friend gets food poisoning from a new sushi place in town. You hear all about it, the stomach cramps, the bathroom disasters, the whole ordeal. A week later, someone suggests that same sushi spot for dinner. What's the first thing that pops into your mind? Yup, the food poisoning story. And without realizing it, you start thinking the place must be unsafe, even though hundreds of people may have eaten there without any issues. Your brain just latched onto the scariest, most recent memory and let it steer the wheel. Now here's the thing. The availability heuristic is not some weird glitch in a few people's minds. It is something we all do. It is a mental shortcut that usually helps us, especially when we have to make decisions quickly. But like many shortcuts, it can lead us the wrong way. Let's go back to the plane example. Statistically speaking, flying is way safer than driving. But car crashes don't usually make international headlines. They do not get dramatic music and emotional interviews on the news. So they feel ordinary, not scary. Meanwhile, one plane crash can dominate the news cycle for days, making it feel much more common than it really is. And that is the sneaky thing about the availability heuristic. It is not about what is true. It is about what is memorable. Here is a classic study that shows how powerful this effect can be. In the 1970s, two psychologists, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, gave people a simple task. They read a list of names and then asked participants to judge whether the list had more male or more female names. But there was a twist. In one version of the list, The male names were mostly random, but the female names included celebrities like famous actresses. In another version, it was the reverse. Guess what happened? People consistently guessed that the gender with the more famous names appeared more frequently in the list, even when that was not true. Why? Because the famous names were easier to remember. They stood out. They were more available in the brain. Think about that the next time you hear about a shark attack or a kidnapping on the news. Those events are scary and rare, but they stick in your mind. Meanwhile, the boring, everyday stuff that is actually more likely to harm you, like slipping in the bathroom or texting while driving, feels less urgent, simply because it does not get the same emotional spotlight. So why does this matter? Well, the availability heuristic influences how we spend our money, how we vote, how we raise our kids, and even how we see other people. If the media constantly covers violent crimes, for example, people start thinking crime rates are higher than they really are. If we hear about 1 or 2 bad apples in a certain profession, we start mistrusting everyone in that field, all because those negative examples are easier to recall. And when it comes to our own lives, we do it too. If we remember the one time we failed at something, that memory might shout louder than the many times we succeeded. If someone hurt us in the past, our mind might overestimate how likely it is to happen again. That is the availability heuristic, quietly shaping how we see the world and ourselves. So what can we do about it? First, just knowing that this bias exists helps a lot. When you find yourself making a quick judgment based on one vivid story, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, is this really common, or is it just memorable? Try looking at actual data, or at least ask around. Get more than one point of view. That little step back can make a big difference. And next time your brain starts yelling about that plane crash or that sushi story, you can smile and say, "Thanks, brain, but I think I'll double check the facts this time." Because while our brains are brilliant, they are also a little dramatic sometimes. And that, my friend, is the availability heuristic in action. Imagine you're trying to fix something around the house. Maybe it's a leaky faucet, or maybe you're trying to assemble a piece of furniture. You've seen a couple of YouTube tutorials, and suddenly, you're convinced you know exactly how to do it. You grab your tools, dive in, and before you know it, you're not just fixing the faucet, you're thinking, why hasn't anyone hired me for this? I could probably start my own business fixing leaks. A few hours later, after making a bigger mess, you realize it's not as easy as you thought. Sound familiar? You've just experienced something called the Dunning-Kruger Effect. It's a cognitive bias that can make us feel overly confident in our abilities, especially when we don't know much about something. And if you've ever felt like you were a natural at something right away, only to later find out how much more there is to learn, you've probably felt this bias in action. So, what exactly is the Dunning-Kruger effect? Well, it's a psychological phenomenon where people with low ability in a specific area tend to overestimate their skills. They don't just think they're good at something, they think they're better than others, even experts. It's like thinking you're ready to run a marathon after a single jog around the block. The problem is, when we know little, we often don't realize how much we don't know, and that can lead to some pretty funny and sometimes frustrating situations. But here's where it gets interesting. The Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't just affect people who are new to something, it can also sneak up on experts. When we get better at something, we start to realize just how much we don't know, and our confidence levels start to drop. So, while beginners might think they have everything figured out, experts often struggle with doubts and feel like there's always more to learn. It's almost like the more you learn, the less confident you feel. Think about someone who just learned a new language. At first, they can say a few phrases and they feel on top of the world. Hola, ¿cómo estás? They proudly announce, thinking they're fluent. A few months later, after learning more, they realize how much more complicated the language really is. They start thinking, wait, I don't even know how to order food properly. This shift from overconfidence to a more realistic understanding of one's skills is a hallmark of the Dunning-Kruger effect. The key takeaway here is that it's not about knowing less. It's about understanding how much more there is to know. Why does this matter? The Dunning-Kruger effect can show up in all sorts of areas of life, from work to relationships to even our hobbies. It can lead us to make bad decisions or underestimate challenges. For example, imagine you're new to a job and think you understand everything after just a week of training. You might start offering advice to your colleagues or even disagreeing with your manager, all because you're confident in your limited knowledge. But this can create tension and even cause mistakes that could have been avoided if you had recognized how much more there was to learn. Now, let's dive into a famous study that really highlights the Dunning-Kruger effect. In the year 2000, two psychologists, David Dunning and Justin Krueger, conducted an experiment to see how well people could judge their own abilities. They had participants take tests in areas like humor, grammar, and logical reasoning. The results were fascinating. People who performed the worst on these tests were the ones who were most confident about their abilities. On the other hand, those who scored the highest were often the least confident, doubting their own answers. The studies showed that people who lack knowledge or skills often can't recognize their limitations, which leads them to be overconfident. This study was so groundbreaking that it actually led to the cognitive bias being named after the researchers. But the Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't just exist in studies, it shows up in everyday life all the time. Think about social media influencers who give advice on complex topics like finance or health. Despite having little professional experience in those fields, their overconfidence often attracts followers because people like the certainty they project. Meanwhile, those with more experience in these areas might be more cautious in offering advice, knowing just how complicated things can be. This is a classic example of the Dunning-Kruger effect in action. So what can we do about it? First, it's important to recognize that overconfidence often comes from a lack of knowledge. When we're beginners at something, it's easy to feel like we have it all figured out. But if we stay humble and keep learning, we can avoid making decisions based on that initial overconfidence. The more we understand about something, the more we can appreciate how complex it really is. Second, we can learn to listen to others, especially those with more experience. Experts don't just know more, they've also learned to recognize how much they still have to learn. In the end, understanding the Dunning-Kruger effect can help us become more self-aware and make better decisions. It teaches us that confidence isn't always a sign of competence, and it's okay to admit when we don't know something. After all, it's not about being perfect right away, it's about growing and improving over time. So, next time you find yourself feeling overly confident in a new skill or task, take a step back. Ask yourself, how much do I really know about this? And remember that it's okay to be a beginner. The more you learn, the more you'll realize just how much there is to discover. And who knows, you might just avoid making that leaky faucet situation a whole lot worse. Have you ever looked back at a decision you made, like a choice in a game, a financial decision, or even picking a movie, and thought, wow, it's so obvious now. I totally should have known that would happen. If so, you're not alone. In fact, this kind of thinking happens to all of us more often than we realize, and there's a name for it, hindsight bias. But don't worry, we'll dive into exactly what that means and why it's important. Let's start with a quick, relatable example. Imagine you're watching a football game. The team you're rooting for is about to make a crucial play. Everyone's on the edge of their seats. The quarterback throws the ball, but oh no, it's intercepted. A collective groan fills the room. But wait, then someone says, honestly, I saw that coming from a mile away. They should have never tried that play. Sound familiar? We've all heard it or even said it ourselves. Now here's the thing. At that exact moment, it feels totally obvious that the play was doomed to fail. But think about it. In the heat of the game, most of us didn't see it coming. After the event happens, though, we suddenly act like we knew all along. That's hindsight bias at work. It's the tendency to believe, after an event has occurred, that we could have predicted the outcome. And the truth is, we probably couldn't have. Hindsight bias is sneaky. It makes us feel like we should have known what was going to happen, even though we couldn't have predicted it at the time. And here's where it gets tricky. This bias affects the way we learn from our past experiences. Because when we look back, it feels like everything was obvious in hindsight. We might not adjust our future decisions as much as we should. After all, if we think we already knew what was going to happen, we might skip over the important lessons we could have learned. Understanding hindsight bias is really important because it shows up in lots of areas of our lives, especially when we're making judgments or decisions. It happens in everyday situations, like picking the right stock to invest in, deciding who to trust, or even just choosing the best route to take on a road trip. It's easy to think that we should have known the right answer all along, but this can lead us to overlook how unpredictable life really is. The bias also makes us less forgiving of ourselves and others. For example, in a job interview, you might think, of course they didn't get the job. They didn't answer that one question well enough. But when you were in the moment, you might not have noticed that same mistake. After the fact, though, it's easy to believe it should have been obvious. Or think about a big decision you've made, like choosing a career path. Later, it might seem like the correct choice was clear from the start. But when you made that decision, it was filled with uncertainty and doubt. To help drive the point home, let's look at a famous study that demonstrates hindsight bias. In the 1970s, researchers conducted a study with a group of participants. They asked them to watch a recorded football game and predict which team would win. After the game, they asked the participants to recall their predictions. The surprising thing, after watching the game and knowing the outcome, the participants confidently said they had predicted the winner all along. In reality, most of them hadn't, but hindsight bias made them believe they had. Now, you might be wondering why hindsight bias happens. One reason is that our brains love patterns. It helps us make sense of the world. So, once we know the outcome of an event, it's easier to see how everything led up to that outcome. This is the brain's way of creating a neat, logical story. But in reality, life is messy and unpredictable, and we don't always have all the information we need to predict what will happen. The key takeaway here is that hindsight bias can affect how we view our past decisions. It can make us overly critical of ourselves, others, or even situations that were completely out of our control. But once we understand it, we can start to question whether we're really seeing things clearly when we look back at the past. And by doing that, we can make better, more thoughtful decisions moving forward. So the next time you're reflecting on an event or decision, take a step back. Ask yourself, was this as obvious as it seems now? Were there factors I couldn't have predicted at the time? Recognizing hindsight bias can help you understand your past choices without the distortion of, I should have known better. And who knows? Maybe next time you're watching a football game, you'll remember that it's easier to see what's coming once it's already happened. Have you ever heard someone say, I did well on that test because I studied hard, but when they fail, they say, the test was unfair? Or maybe you've noticed this in your own life. When things go great, it's all about your effort, your brilliance, your skill. But when things don't go as planned, it's never your fault. It's the weather, the teacher, or some other external factor. Sound familiar? This is a classic example of what psychologists call self-serving bias. So what exactly is self-serving bias? Well, in simple terms, it's the way we tend to take credit for our successes, but blame outside factors when things don't go our way. It's a natural human tendency to protect our self-esteem. We like to think we're in control, that we're competent and capable. When things go right, we attribute it to our hard work, intelligence, or skills. But when things go wrong, it's easy to point fingers at anything but ourselves, like bad luck or someone else's mistake. Now, you might be thinking, I don't do that, I'm pretty objective. But here's the thing, this bias is so common and subtle that we usually don't even realize we're doing it. The truth is, most people fall into this trap without even trying. In fact, studies show that people are much more likely to credit themselves for positive outcomes and blame external factors for negative ones. And they do this without even being aware of it. It's like a built-in defense mechanism for our ego. The reason self-serving bias is so tricky is that it seems to make sense at first. It's comforting to think that when we succeed, it's because of our own efforts. It boosts our confidence, our motivation, and our belief in our abilities. But when things don't go as planned, it's easier to avoid the uncomfortable feeling of admitting we might not have done everything right. So instead of saying, I could have studied more, we say, the test was unfair, or the instructions were unclear. But here's the thing, when we fall into this trap, we miss the opportunity to learn from our mistakes. If we're always pointing to external factors as the cause of our failures, we never really stop to ask ourselves, what could I do better next time? We don't grow, we don't improve, and we don't get better at taking responsibility for our actions. Understanding self-serving bias is crucial because it shows up in so many areas of our lives. It can affect how we interact with others, how we view our successes and failures, and even how we build relationships. Imagine this, you've just finished a group project, and it's been a tough ride. If the project does well, you might tell your friends, I knew I had the best ideas for this. But if it doesn't do so well, you might say, well, not everyone in the group pulled their weight, or we didn't have enough time to finish properly. This is self-serving bias in action. You're protecting your self-esteem by crediting yourself for the success and blaming others for the failure. Self-serving bias also influences our relationships. If something goes wrong in a friendship or romantic relationship, it's easy to blame the other person. They didn't listen to me, or they're always so difficult. But when things are going well, we might say, I'm really good at making people happy. This can lead to unnecessary tension, misunderstandings, and conflicts because both sides are focused on preserving their own self-image, rather than being open to understanding the full story. Let's take a famous real-world example of self-serving bias. In the world of sports, this is often seen in interviews after a game. When a team wins, players and coaches will often say things like, we worked hard, we were prepared, and we executed our game plan perfectly. They're taking full credit for the win. But when the team loses, the excuses start rolling in. The referee made a bad call, or the other team was just luckier today. In both cases, players and coaches are using self-serving bias. They're taking credit for the good and deflecting blame for the bad. A study conducted by psychologists shows just how strong self-serving bias can be. In this study, students were asked to evaluate their own performance on a test. When students did well, they rated their own intelligence very highly. But when they did poorly, they blamed the test itself, claiming it was unfair or too difficult. Even though the test was the same for everyone, their perception of their own performance was heavily influenced by their own self-serving bias. So, what can we do about it? The first step is simply being aware of it. When we catch ourselves praising ourselves too much after a success, or blaming others after a failure, we can take a step back and ask, what's really going on here? Could there be something I could improve on? Could I have done something differently? The more we practice taking responsibility for our actions, both good and bad, the more we'll be able to grow and become better versions of ourselves. It's not about beating ourselves up when things go wrong. It's about learning from our mistakes and not letting our ego stand in the way of progress. Self-serving bias is something that everyone experiences to some degree. It's a natural way to protect our self-esteem, but it can also prevent us from learning and growing. By being aware of this bias and striving to take responsibility for both our successes and our failures, we can build more honest, open, and meaningful relationships with others and with ourselves. So next time you win or lose, take a moment to reflect and ask, what part did I play in this outcome? You might just learn something valuable. Have you ever found yourself driving down the road, minding your own business, when someone cuts you off? What's your immediate reaction? You probably think, wow, that person is such a jerk, right? You might even call them names under your breath, annoyed by their reckless behavior. But what if I told you that you might be jumping to conclusions without realizing it? Let's take a step back and think about this. Maybe that person who cut you off wasn't actually a jerk. Maybe they were running late for an important meeting or had an emergency. But in that split second, you didn't know any of that, did you? Instead of considering their situation, you jumped straight to judging their character. And guess what? This happens all the time. In fact, it's a psychological mistake that's so common. It has a name. It's called the fundamental attribution error. Okay, so let me break it down. The fundamental attribution error is when we tend to overestimate how much someone's behavior is influenced by their personality and underestimate the role that the situation plays. Basically, we think people do things because of who they are, not because of what's going on around them. In the case of the person cutting you off, you're more likely to think they're a bad driver or they're just rude, instead of considering maybe they're in a rush. It's like we ignore the context and focus only on the person's character. Now, this might sound a bit confusing at first. After all, we've all had moments where someone else's actions made us think poorly of them. Maybe you've had a boss who seemed super grumpy all the time, and you thought, wow, what a miserable person. Or a friend who didn't text you back and you assumed they were just being rude. It's really easy to go down that road. We all do it, all the time, without even realizing it. But here's the problem. When we make these judgments, we're ignoring the situation that might have caused the behavior. The boss might be stressed about work, and the friend could have been dealing with something personal. It's not always as simple as, they're just a bad person. But because of the fundamental attribution error, we tend to assume the worst about others without considering external factors. Now you might be thinking, so what? Does it really matter if we make these assumptions? The truth is, it can have a big impact on how we see the world and how we interact with others. If we always assume that people's actions are based on their personality, it can lead to misunderstandings, unnecessary conflicts, and missed opportunities to empathize with others. For example, if you assume your boss is always angry and mean, you might avoid talking to them or misinterpret their actions. But what if they're just having a tough time and need your support? The way you see others can shape your relationships and interactions in ways you might not even realize. Let's make this a bit more real with an example. In a famous study by social psychologist Lee Ross, participants watched a college student answer questions on a quiz. The student was asked questions that were either really hard or really easy, and they had to give answers out loud. Half of the participants were told that the student was the one who picked the questions, while the other half was told that the questions were chosen randomly. The results: the people who thought the student chose the questions believed that their intelligence was a reflection of their personality. In other words, they thought, this person is really smart if they answered the questions well, and this person is dumb if they didn't. They ignored the fact that the questions were either easy or hard by chance. This study shows us just how powerful the fundamental attribution error can be. We judge people based on what we see, and we don't always take into account the factors influencing their actions. The truth is, everyone is shaped by circumstances, experiences, and situations that we might never know about. So why should you care about this bias? First off, being aware of the fundamental attribution error helps you become more empathetic. When you catch yourself jumping to conclusions about someone, pause and think, could there be something else going on here? It could be something as simple as, maybe they're just having a bad day, or maybe they didn't mean to hurt my feelings. By doing this, you'll not only understand others better, but you'll also avoid unnecessary conflicts and misjudgments. Also, understanding this bias can improve your own self-awareness. Often, we're guilty of committing the opposite bias, known as the self-serving bias. This is when we tend to blame external factors for our own mistakes, but take full credit for our successes. So next time you catch yourself saying, "I didn't make that mistake because of me, it was because of the environment," remember that others might be doing the same thing, but in reverse. The next time you find yourself thinking someone is a bad person because of their actions, just remember, we're all shaped by the situations we find ourselves in. The person who cut you off, they might just be late for something important. That friend who didn't respond to your text, they might be dealing with a personal issue. And the boss who seems grumpy, they might just be stressed about something that has nothing to do with you. So next time you're about to judge someone, take a deep breath and ask yourself, what's going on behind the scenes that I might not know about? Imagine this. You just spent hours cooking a delicious dinner and everything turns out perfectly. The flavors are balanced, the presentation looks like it came straight from a food magazine, and you're excited to share it with your friends. But then, one person takes a bite and says, it's okay, but the seasoning could be better. Suddenly, that one comment sticks with you. You're no longer thinking about how amazing the meal was. All you can focus on is that one negative remark. You might even start doubting your cooking skills, even though the other 5 people at the table loved the meal. Ever wonder why that happens? Welcome to the world of negativity bias. Negativity bias is a psychological phenomenon that makes us pay more attention to negative experiences or information than positive ones. It's like our brains are built with a magnet for bad news, and we're constantly picking up negative details, even when there are plenty of positives around. The tricky part is that we often don't realize it's happening, and it affects our thoughts, decisions, and emotions in ways we might not even notice. Think about it. Have you ever had a great day overall, but one small mistake or unpleasant interaction completely ruins your mood? Maybe you got a compliment on your outfit, your project was praised at work, and you had a fun chat with a friend. But then you received one piece of criticism, and suddenly that's all you can think about. It might even overshadow everything else that went well. You're not alone. This tendency to focus on the negative is something that almost everyone experiences, and it's exactly what negativity bias is all about. So why do we do this? Well, scientists believe it's tied to our evolutionary past. Thousands of years ago, our ancestors had to be hyper-aware of potential dangers to survive. If they saw a snake, they couldn't afford to ignore it and focus on something positive like the sunset. They needed to react quickly to stay safe. Our brains evolved to prioritize threats and negative experiences as a survival mechanism. Today, that's still with us, even though we don't face the same life or death situations. Our brains are hardwired to react more strongly to negative events because, back in the day, doing so could literally save our lives. Understanding negativity bias is important because it shows up everywhere in our lives. It affects our relationships, work, social media habits, and even our self-esteem. Ever get a compliment, but then dwell on the one criticism someone gave you? That's negativity bias in action. Or maybe you scroll through social media and find 10 posts that are positive and uplifting, but one negative comment about a post leaves you feeling upset. We're more likely to share bad news than good news, and this can amplify our feelings of stress or frustration. When we focus too much on the negative, we might even start to overlook the positive aspects of our lives. To make this even clearer, let's take a look at a famous experiment. In one study, participants were asked to look at a list of words. The list had both positive and negative words, like happy and angry. The researchers found that people could recall the negative words much more easily than the positive ones. Even though the positive words were just as frequent, the negative ones stuck in their minds more strongly. This experiment shows how our brains naturally gravitate toward the negative, even when the positive is just as abundant. It's a bit like how you remember the one rude comment at a party, but forget about all the compliments you received. Negativity bias can also have an impact on our decisions. For instance, If someone leaves a bad review about a product or service, even if the company has hundreds of positive reviews, that one negative review might be enough to make you hesitate before buying. The bad review sticks out like a sore thumb, overshadowing all the positive feedback. This is why businesses and people need to work extra hard to make sure they're addressing negative feedback quickly and effectively. It can have a much bigger impact than the good stuff. But what can we do about it? The first step is simply being aware that this bias exists. Once you realize that your brain is naturally inclined to focus on the negative, you can start to counteract it. Try making a conscious effort to notice the positive things in your life. For example, after a long day, instead of fixating on the one thing that went wrong, take a moment to appreciate the things that went right. You might have gotten a great piece of feedback at work, spent quality time with a friend, or just enjoyed a beautiful sunset. The more you train your brain to focus on the positive, the easier it becomes to overcome the pull of negativity. Another strategy is practicing gratitude. Each day, think of at least 3 things you're grateful for. They don't have to be big things. Maybe it's a nice cup of coffee or a compliment you received. By intentionally focusing on the good things, you can begin to shift your mindset and reduce the power of negativity bias. Negativity bias is something we all experience, but it doesn't have to control us. By understanding how it works and making small changes to our thought patterns, we can start to embrace a more balanced and positive outlook on life. So next time you find yourself fixating on something negative, take a step back and ask yourself, what's the positive side of this? You might be surprised at how much more there is to appreciate. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where everyone around you seems to be talking about something and you start to feel like you're missing out? Maybe it's the latest trend on social media, or everyone's suddenly obsessed with a new movie. At first, you might not care at all, but then you notice it's everywhere. Your friends won't stop talking about it, and even your co-workers are all buzzing about it. Before you know it, you've given in and joined the conversation, even though you weren't really sure why it was such a big deal in the first place. You're not alone in this. This feeling is part of something called the bandwagon effect. The bandwagon effect is a powerful force that influences how we make decisions and form opinions. Simply put, it's the tendency to do something just because everyone else is doing it. It's the reason why a new trend can suddenly seem irresistible, even if it's not something you'd typically be interested in. It's also why we might start liking something just because we see other people enjoying it. It's like jumping onto a bandwagon, getting swept up by the momentum of the crowd. You might be thinking, I don't just follow the crowd, I make my own decisions. Here's the catch. Most of us don't even realize when we're falling for this bias. It's sneaky. You might think you're choosing to do something on your own, but in reality, you're just following the herd without even realizing it. This bias is at play in so many areas of our lives, from the products we buy to the opinions we form. So why is it that we often make choices based on what others are doing? One reason is that it feels safe. When everyone around you seems to be doing something, it feels like you're making the right decision by joining in. After all, if so many people are doing it, it must be good, right? It's like the old saying, if everyone else jumped off a cliff, would you jump too? Well, the bandwagon effect makes it feel like that leap might not be such a bad idea. The bandwagon effect can show up in lots of situations: shopping, politics, social media, and even sports. Ever notice how certain brands become insanely popular, even though they didn't have a standout product or service at first? That's the bandwagon effect at work. People see others buying and using a product, and they want to be part of that group too. So they hop on the bandwagon and buy it, even if they didn't particularly need or want it before. Take voting, for example. In an election, if people see a particular candidate gaining a lot of support, they may jump on that bandwagon, thinking that this candidate must be the best choice simply because others are supporting them. This doesn't always mean they fully researched the candidate or their policies. It just means they're following the crowd. The bandwagon effect makes it hard to make independent decisions because there's a subtle pressure to conform to what everyone else is doing. Now, let's think about the rise of the smartphone. You probably remember when the first iPhone came out, right? It was revolutionary, but what made it even more powerful was that everyone wanted one. People didn't just buy it because it was a great product, though it was. They bought it because it became a cultural symbol. As more and more people started using iPhones, the pressure to get one grew. Soon, it felt like everyone had one, and if you didn't, you might have felt a little left out. That's the bandwagon effect in action. But the bandwagon effect isn't just harmless fun. It can actually lead to some bad decisions. Ever heard of the phrase, too good to be true? Sometimes we get swept up in something just because it's popular, without considering whether it's the best choice for us. For instance, how many times have you seen a new product or service get a huge following, only to later realize it wasn't all it was cracked up to be? Or how about when you join a trend or a movement, only to find out later that it wasn't as great as you thought? The bandwagon effect can sometimes trick us into making decisions based on popularity rather than practicality or quality. One study that illustrates the bandwagon effect involved college students and their choice of snacks. In this experiment, students were offered a choice between two types of snacks. One snack was labeled as most popular among students, while the other was just labeled normally. The students were more likely to choose the snack that was marked as popular, even if they hadn't heard of it before or didn't necessarily like it. This study shows how we're influenced by social proof, basically, the idea that we look to others to guide our decisions, even when it's not the best choice for us. It's not just about snacks or phones, though. The bandwagon effect plays a huge role in how we form opinions about almost everything. Whether it's the latest celebrity gossip or the most talked about political candidate, we're constantly influenced by the opinions and actions of others. The tricky thing is that by the time we realize it, it's often too late to change our minds. So, what can we do to avoid getting trapped by the bandwagon effect? First, it's important to recognize when it's happening. When you feel that pull to go along with the crowd, take a moment to ask yourself if it's really your choice or if you're just following the herd. It's also helpful to take a step back and think critically about the decision at hand. Ask yourself questions like, what's my real reason for wanting to join this trend? Am I making this choice because it's genuinely right for me, or am I just following what everyone else is doing? The next time you feel the bandwagon effect tugging at you, just remember, it's okay to march to the beat of your own drum. You don't have to follow the crowd to make the right choices for yourself. Imagine this. You're at a movie theater, excited for the new blockbuster film. The lights dim, the movie starts, and about 20 minutes in, you realize it's not great. In fact, it's pretty terrible. The plot is confusing, the acting is cringy, and the special effects look like they were made in someone's basement. But here's the kicker. You paid full price for that ticket. So, you stay. You sit through the entire 2-hour movie, even though you could have walked out and done something better with your time. Why? Because you already paid for the ticket, and you feel like you have to finish it. You're too deep in to turn back. Sound familiar? Well, this is a perfect example of the sunk cost fallacy in action. But don't worry if that term sounds a little fancy. We'll break it down together, and you'll see how this kind of thinking shows up in your life more often than you might think. The sunk cost fallacy happens when people continue with something simply because they've already invested time, money, or effort into it, even when it's clear that it's not the best decision. The key thing here is that the costs have already been incurred. They're sunk, you can't get them back, no matter what you do. But for some reason, people still feel the need to keep going, thinking that if they just stick with it, it'll somehow justify the earlier investment. So why does this happen? Well, humans are funny creatures. We don't like to feel like we're wasting things, whether it's our money, our time, or even our energy. So when we've already put something into something like that movie ticket, a failed project, or an unproductive relationship, Our brains trick us into thinking that we have to push through to make that original investment worth it. In other words, we're motivated by the fear of regret and the need to avoid the feeling of loss. You've probably experienced this before. Maybe it's with a subscription service that you no longer use, but you keep paying for it every month because you feel like you've already paid for a year, and it'd be a waste to cancel it. Or maybe it's with an old car that's costing you more and more in repairs, but you're hesitant to get rid of it because you've already spent so much on fixing it. You stick with it, even though logically it would make more sense to cut your losses and move on. But here's the thing. The more you stick with something, just because you've already invested in it, the more likely you are to waste even more time, energy, or money. It's like digging yourself deeper into a hole because you're trying to justify the digging, even though you could just stop and walk away from the hole entirely. The truth is, the best way to avoid making a bigger loss is to recognize when it's time to quit, regardless of what you've already put in. Let's take a famous example from history to illustrate this. In the late 1960s, the US government was deeply involved in the Vietnam War. The country had already invested billions of dollars and countless lives in the war, and yet the situation was becoming increasingly dire. But instead of cutting their losses and withdrawing, US leaders kept pushing forward, thinking that leaving would mean the earlier investment was all for nothing. They couldn't accept that they had made a bad choice. In the end, the war dragged on for years, costing even more lives and money, and the eventual outcome wasn't much different from where they started. This was a classic case of the sunk cost fallacy, the unwillingness to stop a losing endeavor simply because of past investments. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but sometimes sticking with something can be a good thing, right? And you're right. There are definitely times when persevering is important. For example, when learning a new skill or working toward a long-term goal. But the sunk cost fallacy isn't about persistence. It's about irrationally sticking with something just to avoid the feeling of losing something that's already been spent. If continuing doesn't add value or move you closer to your goal, then it's probably time to reconsider. So, how can you avoid falling into this trap? Well, the first step is awareness. Once you recognize that you're staying in a situation purely because of what you've already put in, take a step back and ask yourself, what's the best decision for me now, given the situation as it is, not based on the past? By focusing on the present and future, rather than dwelling on what's already gone, you'll be better equipped to make smarter, more rational choices. To wrap it up, the sunk cost fallacy is one of those sneaky biases that we all fall victim to from time to time. It's all about knowing when to cut your losses and move forward, even when it feels uncomfortable. Whether it's a bad movie, a broken down car, or an investment that's just not paying off, remember that what you've already spent, whether it's money, time, or energy, is gone. The best thing you can do is make decisions based on where you want to go, not where you've been. And hey, next time you're stuck watching a terrible movie, remember, it's okay to walk out and grab a snack instead. Your future self will thank you for it. Have you ever found yourself looking at something you just completed, whether it's a school project, a new recipe you tried, or a DIY home improvement task, and thought, nailed it? But then, when you show it to someone else, you realize it's not quite as perfect as you imagined. Maybe you overlooked a detail or something wasn't quite right, but your mind had convinced you everything was great. Sounds familiar, right? It's easy to get caught up in the belief that we know exactly what we're doing, and this feeling is all too common. This mindset, where we overestimate our abilities or knowledge, is actually a well-known phenomenon called overconfidence bias. Overconfidence bias happens when we think we know more than we really do, or we overestimate how well we can do something. It's like believing you can ace a test without studying, because you remember a few key concepts, only to realize you missed a lot of important material. Or maybe you think you can solve a problem in the shortest amount of time possible, only to discover you've spent twice as long on it as you originally thought. Sound like something you've experienced? This bias is something that sneaks up on us all the time, and it can happen in any situation. Sometimes we don't even realize we're being overconfident, whether it's assuming we can beat the traffic without checking the map, thinking we'll be fine without an umbrella on a cloudy day, or even thinking we can handle a job we've never done before. We all fall into this trap at some point. So what's going on here? Overconfidence bias is when we believe we're more capable or knowledgeable than we really are. It can make us take unnecessary risks or ignore important details because we think we've got everything under control. You might think that the only thing it affects is our ego, but it actually has real consequences. It can influence the choices we make, from big life decisions to small everyday actions. And it's everywhere, from business to relationships, from the way we manage our money to how we judge others. Let's think about how overconfidence bias works in the real world. Think about a stock investor who is so sure of their ability to pick the next big winner that they ignore warning signs or expert advice. Or think about someone who starts a new job and assumes they already know how everything works, only to be caught off guard by unexpected challenges. In both cases, their overconfidence leads them to make poor choices that could have been avoided with a little more self-awareness. A famous study on this bias comes from a group of psychologists who studied people's ability to predict how long it would take them to complete a task. Participants were asked to estimate how long a task would take them, like writing an essay or completing a project. Almost everyone ended up overestimating their ability to finish on time. Not only did they think it would take them less time than it actually did, but they also failed to account for potential roadblocks along the way. This is classic overconfidence bias at work. We believe we know how things will go, but we overlook the unknowns. This bias can show up in big ways too. In one study, people who were highly confident in their ability to predict the weather or make financial decisions were more likely to ignore expert advice and make decisions based on their own judgment. But when they looked back at their predictions, they realized that they were way off. Overconfidence bias doesn't just affect individuals though. It's something that can influence entire industries, companies, and even entire economies. Businesses that think they have the market cornered might overlook competitors, or investors might push forward with risky projects because they believe they're destined to succeed. But this overconfidence can lead to failure and missed opportunities. Overconfidence bias doesn't always have to lead to disaster, but it can be a major stumbling block. So why does it matter? Understanding this bias can help us become more realistic about our capabilities and avoid taking unnecessary risks. By recognizing that we might not always have all the information, we can make better decisions, whether it's in our careers, personal finances, or even our everyday choices. In the end, recognizing overconfidence bias is a tool that helps us make smarter, more thoughtful choices. Instead of rushing in with the assumption that we know everything, we can step back, be more cautious, and gather the right information. We might not always get everything right, but we'll have a better chance of avoiding the pitfalls of overestimating our abilities. So next time you're tempted to dive into something without fully considering the details, remember that a little healthy skepticism can go a long way. After all, sometimes it's better to be aware of what we don't know than to be overconfident about what we think we do. You've probably had one of those moments where you're debating whether to keep an old pair of shoes, even though they've been sitting in your closet for years and are clearly falling apart. You tell yourself you'll get rid of them, but then you pause. Something about it feels wrong, like you're losing something important. That feeling is all about loss aversion. It's the psychological reason we hate losing things more than we enjoy gaining new ones, even when it doesn't make any logical sense. Loss aversion is a concept from behavioral economics, and it explains a lot of our everyday decisions. It's the reason we might hold on to that old pair of shoes, even though we know they're no longer useful. It's why we're so quick to regret losing $1, but don't always celebrate gaining one. The loss feels worse than the equivalent gain feels good. It's also why, if you're like many people, you might stay in a bad situation, like an unhappy job or a toxic friendship, simply because the idea of leaving or cutting your losses feels too painful. We tend to put far more weight on avoiding loss than on pursuing potential gains. If you've ever been reluctant to make a change in your life or decision-making because the loss just seemed too overwhelming, you've felt loss aversion at work. But here's the twist. It's not just about tangible things like money or possessions. Loss aversion plays a role in how we feel about experiences and even emotions. For example, if someone criticizes your work, you're likely to remember that criticism far more than any praise you've received. That sting of losing a bit of self-esteem outweighs all the positive feedback you've gotten, and suddenly, the good stuff feels insignificant. So why does this happen? Essentially, loss aversion is a part of our evolutionary design. In the past, humans had to make quick decisions about survival. Losing something, whether it was food, safety, or social standing, could mean life or death. Over time, our brains developed a tendency to focus more on avoiding loss than on gaining something new. It's a protective mechanism designed to help us avoid harm. But today, we're not worried about being eaten by wild animals, so this tendency can actually work against us, leading us to make decisions that aren't always in our best interest. You might be thinking, okay, I get it. We hate losing things, but where does it really show up in my life? Well, loss aversion is everywhere. It can affect your spending habits, your relationships, and even your career choices. For instance, let's say you've been holding onto a stock in the hopes that its value will go back up after a dip. Even though the loss is real and the stock is unlikely to recover, your brain tricks you into thinking that holding on is better than letting go. You fear the psychological pain of the loss more than the potential benefit of moving on. This is why people often make bad investments, sticking with losing stocks or assets far too long. Loss aversion also shows up in marketing and consumer behavior. Ever notice how stores often offer discounts framed as "don't miss out" or "limited time offer"? That's because marketers know that the fear of losing out on a deal is a powerful motivator. We're far more likely to buy something when we feel like we're avoiding a loss, even if we don't actually need it. There's a famous study that really highlights the impact of loss aversion. In the study, participants were given either a coffee mug or a chocolate bar. They were then asked how much they would be willing to sell their item for. Those who received the mug asked for more money to sell it, while those who received the chocolate bar were willing to part with it for less. But here's the kicker. If they were offered a trade, most people weren't interested in the swap. They preferred keeping their item, even if the other item was more valuable or desirable. This study demonstrated that people value what they have much more highly than what they don't have. It's the loss of what they've already got that hurts more than the potential gain of something else. Another real-world example is when someone sells an old car that's worth far less than what they paid for it. Even though they've already lost that money, they might hang on to the car longer than they should, simply because selling it feels like admitting defeat. This is loss aversion at its finest. Choosing to hold on to something that's already lost value, just to avoid feeling like they've lost even more. Now, knowing about loss aversion is helpful because it can actually help you make better decisions. Once you understand that your brain is hardwired to resist loss, you can start to take steps to counteract this bias. One way is to think in terms of opportunities rather than losses. If you're faced with a tough decision, try focusing on the potential gain rather than the loss you might experience. It can help you overcome the fear of loss and make choices that benefit you in the long run. Understanding loss aversion also helps us become more compassionate when dealing with other people. When someone holds on to something, whether it's an old habit or an unproductive belief, it's often because they're afraid of losing something, even if it's not rational. Recognizing this can make it easier to empathize and communicate in ways that help them let go of what no longer serves them. Loss aversion is one of those subtle but powerful forces in our decision-making process. It shapes how we think, what we value, and how we act. By becoming aware of it, we can start to make more rational decisions, let go of unnecessary baggage, and avoid letting the fear of loss control us. So next time you're holding on to something, whether it's a physical object, a job, or a decision, ask yourself, am I avoiding loss more than I'm embracing a better future? You know how when you go grocery shopping, you sometimes end up buying things you didn't plan for. You could be standing in front of a shelf, looking at two brands of cereal. One says low fat, and the other says contains 30% less fat than regular cereal. You're probably thinking, well, I want the healthier option, right? But here's the catch. Both cereals are actually pretty much the same in terms of fat content. The only difference is how the information is framed. This is exactly what we call the framing effect, and it's more powerful than you might think. We all like to think we make decisions based on facts, that we're logical and rational, but in reality, our brains are constantly being influenced by the way information is presented to us, without us even realizing it. And the framing effect is one of the most sneaky ways that happens. The framing effect is a cognitive bias, where the way something is presented or framed influences our decisions and perceptions, even if the information itself doesn't change. It's like looking at a glass that's either half full or half empty. It's the same amount of liquid, but the way it's framed can make us feel either optimistic or pessimistic about the situation. This bias shows up all over the place. Think about how often we see advertisements for products that emphasize a discount rather than the price reduction on the same product. Or when a doctor tells you, you have a 90% chance of surviving this procedure, versus there's a 10% chance you might not make it. Even though the statistics are the same, the framing can completely change how you feel about it. So why do we fall for this? It's because our brains are wired to process information quickly, especially when we're overwhelmed or under time pressure. Instead of analyzing every little detail, we tend to rely on shortcuts or mental shortcuts, and the way information is framed is one of those shortcuts. But the thing is, we don't always notice how these subtle shifts in framing affect us. We might think we're making an informed decision, but we're actually being swayed by how a message is presented. Let's take a step back and think about where the framing effect shows up in real life. It's in the news we consume, the way politicians speak, even in the way companies sell us things. The news might tell you that a politician cut taxes for the wealthy, but that same politician could also be said to have reduced taxes for job creators. These two pieces of information sound very different, right? But they're actually saying the same thing. It's the framing that changes how you feel about it. One famous study that shows the framing effect in action comes from the psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for his work on behavioral economics. In one of his experiments, he presented people with a choice between two medical treatments for a disease. One option was framed in terms of survival. There's a 70% chance of surviving. The other was framed in terms of death. There's a 30% chance of dying. Even though the chances were the same, people overwhelmingly chose the 70% survival option as it felt like a more positive and safer choice. This is a perfect example of how framing can shape our decisions, even when the underlying information is identical. It's the same 70% survival rate either way, but the way it's presented changes how we perceive it. So, why does it matter? Well, recognizing the framing effect can help us make better decisions in our everyday lives. When you're making a choice about anything, whether it's about a product, a decision at work, or even a big life decision, ask yourself, how is this information being framed? What's being emphasized here? And this goes beyond just consumer decisions. The framing effect plays a huge role in our political beliefs, our social opinions, and even how we approach relationships. Understanding this bias helps us see the world more clearly and make decisions based on facts rather than being led by subtle influences we might not even be aware of. Next time you're faced with a decision, whether it's about buying a new gadget or deciding on a career move, take a moment to think. Are you being framed in a certain way? Is there another angle that you haven't considered? By understanding the framing effect, you're taking control of your decisions and not letting the way information is presented control you. The framing effect is like a mental trick our brains fall for every day, but with awareness, we can use it to make better choices. So, next time you're picking between two options, whether it's cereal, a new phone, or even a political issue, remember, it's not just about what you see, it's about how it's being framed. By recognizing this bias, you'll be better equipped to look past the framing and see things for what they really are. That way, you can make decisions that are based on the facts, not just the way they're packaged. Have you ever thought, this time I'll definitely stick to my workout routine, or I'll finish this project ahead of schedule, only to find yourself a few weeks later lying on the couch, still putting off that workout or scrambling to finish the project at the last minute? It's not that you don't want to succeed. You probably just had this sneaky little feeling that things would work out in your favor, maybe even without as much effort as they actually need. This is where something called optimism bias kicks in. It's this natural tendency we all have to believe that everything will go better than it probably will. We think we're going to be the exception to the rule, the one who beats the odds. It's the belief that bad things are less likely to happen to us, and good things are more likely, no matter how realistic those outcomes are. And here's the tricky part. It's easy to overlook. You probably didn't even realize you were doing it. In fact, optimism bias is so sneaky that it often shows up when you're planning for the future, making decisions, or even when you're assessing risks. It's like having rose-colored glasses on, making everything seem a little brighter than it really is. But why do we fall for it? Well, it all comes down to how our brains are wired. We tend to be wired to hope for the best, and who can blame us? It feels great to believe that things are going to work out in our favor. But the problem comes when we let that hopeful thinking lead us to underestimate the real effort, risk, or challenges involved in something. For example, let's say you're planning a road trip. You're excited about it. You've mapped out your route, and you're mentally preparing for a smooth, fun ride. But then, when you're hit with a flat tire halfway into the journey, or you get stuck in traffic for hours, the reality hits. What happened? Well, optimism bias made you overlook potential hiccups along the way. You expected everything to go smoothly, so you didn't prepare for the possibility of delays or problems. This bias shows up in all kinds of decisions we make. Let's talk about finances for a second. Maybe you've thought, I'll get a raise soon, or I'll finally start saving this month. These thoughts sound positive and motivating, right? But optimism bias can sometimes make us assume that the raise will come quicker than expected, or that we'll be able to save effortlessly. In reality, things don't always go as planned, and without proper planning, that dream savings account can stay out of reach. So, why does it matter to understand optimism bias? Because it shapes the way we think about risk and reward. It's the reason why people sometimes jump into big projects without fully considering the challenges. It's the reason why people might invest in a get-rich-quick scheme or start a business without a solid plan. We think, it'll work out for me. While a positive mindset is great, it's also important to face reality and consider what could go wrong, not just what could go right. Let's look at a famous example. Remember the 2008 financial crisis? It was a perfect storm of people and institutions overly relying on their optimistic belief that the housing market would keep growing. People thought home prices would keep rising forever, so they took out loans they couldn't afford and made investments they didn't fully understand. They believed they were immune to any negative outcomes. But when the market crashed, those optimistic beliefs were shattered and the fallout was massive. Here's a simpler example. How many times have you told yourself, I can totally finish this essay in 2 hours? But in reality, it takes much longer because you haven't accounted for the distractions or the research that needs to be done. That's optimism bias in action. You underestimated the time and effort needed. You thought you'd be able to breeze through it, but life had other plans. Now that we know how optimism bias shows up in our lives, what can we do about it? First, we need to recognize it. Just knowing that our brains tend to be overly optimistic about how things will unfold can help us take a more balanced approach. Next time you're planning a project or setting goals, try to consider what could go wrong, not just what could go right. Take a moment to ask yourself, what are the potential risks and what could be the challenges? Then, build that into your plan. In some cases, it might even be helpful to plan for setbacks. Give yourself more time than you think you'll need. If you're setting financial goals, create a budget that accounts for unexpected expenses. If you're starting a new project, factor in the possibility of delays and obstacles. By expecting some bumps in the road, you'll be less shocked when they happen, and you'll be better prepared. Optimism. Bias doesn't have to be your enemy. It can keep you motivated and hopeful, but it's also important to stay grounded in reality. By balancing your optimism with preparation, you'll be more successful in the long run. So, the next time you find yourself planning a big project or goal, remember to give yourself a little reality check. Optimism is great, but planning for the unexpected might just be the secret to your success. You know that feeling when you're sitting on your couch, watching your favorite TV show, and then the next episode starts automatically. It's a Friday night, so you're already comfortable, right? You think to yourself, I'll watch just one more episode, even though it's way past your bedtime. But it doesn't stop there. Before you know it, the sun's coming up, and you're still glued to the screen. What happened? You had plans to go to bed early, but somehow, sticking to your routine of watching the same show felt so much easier than breaking it. This is a perfect example of something called status quo bias. You might be wondering, what's status quo bias? Well, it's a fancy way of saying that we tend to stick with what we know, even when change could be better for us. This bias makes us prefer things to stay the same, whether it's that extra episode or the comfort of a routine. We're wired to avoid change, even when it's in our best interest. We've all been there, feeling too tired to cook, so you opt for the same delivery food you always get. Or maybe you stay in a job that doesn't make you happy because it feels safer than trying something new. The truth is, status quo bias shows up in big and small decisions in our lives, and it's not always easy to spot. It's like when you've been driving the same route to work for years, and even though there's a faster, more efficient way, you choose the one you know because it's familiar. The idea of taking a new route, even if it's better, is just uncomfortable. So why do we do this? It's partly because change requires effort, and effort, while beneficial in the long run, often feels like a hassle. We're hardwired to seek comfort and avoid discomfort. Our brains naturally resist the unknown because the status quo, what we already know, feels safe. When we stick to familiar patterns, it gives us a sense of stability. And even if that routine isn't the most exciting, it's predictable. It's like wearing the same shoes every day because you know they're comfortable, even though a new pair might actually be better for your feet. Now, let's talk about why this bias is something we all need to be aware of. Status quo bias isn't just a quirky habit. It can seriously impact the choices we make in our lives. If we always stick with what we know, we might miss out on opportunities for growth, improvement, and better experiences. Think about how many times you've stayed in a relationship or a job longer than you should have. This can help you make better decisions, because it felt easier to stay than to face the challenges of change. Or maybe you found yourself avoiding a new hobby or activity because it's unfamiliar, even though it might bring you joy. Understanding status quo bias, when you recognize it, you can start questioning why you're sticking to the same old thing. Are you avoiding change because it's truly better for you? Or are you just falling into the trap of familiarity? Being aware of this bias allows you to make more conscious choices that align with your long-term goals instead of automatically falling back on what feels easiest. One famous example of status quo bias in action comes from a simple experiment. In the early 2000s, researchers at the University of Pennsylvania conducted a study about people's retirement savings. They found that people were more likely to stick with their current investment plans, even if they could earn a higher return by switching to a different plan. Why? Because changing was hard, and sticking with the status quo felt easier, even though it meant missing out on potential gains. This experiment showed just how powerful this bias can be in financial decisions, something that affects all of us in one way or another. Another real-world example comes from the world of technology. Have you ever noticed how people are often reluctant to try new apps, software, or gadgets, even when they seem like they could improve your life? We tend to stick to the old ones, simply because we're familiar with them. Think about how long it took you to switch from one social media platform to another, even though the new one might have better features. This reluctance to change is driven by status quo bias. It's just easier to keep doing what we're doing, even when we know there might be a better option out there. Now, here's the catch. While status quo bias helps us feel comfortable, it can also hold us back. The key is not to fight the instinct to stay the same, but to recognize when it's preventing us from making progress. The next time you're stuck in a routine or hesitant to try something new, pause and ask yourself, is this really the best choice for me? Or am I just sticking with what I know because it's easier? Understanding status quo bias empowers us to take charge of our decisions. It's all about breaking free from the automatic choices we make and actively choosing what's best for us. By making small, intentional changes, whether that's trying a new route to work, exploring new hobbies, or even considering a career shift, we can start making decisions that lead us toward growth and opportunity. So, the next time you find yourself stuck in a rut, ask yourself if you're falling into the trap of status quo bias. If you are, that's okay. Just recognize it and think about whether it's time to step out of your comfort zone. After all, sometimes the greatest rewards come from embracing change and trying something new. We've all been there. You walk into a room full of people, maybe at a party or a meeting, and you immediately find yourself gravitating toward a small group of people who seem to be just like you. Maybe they have similar interests, or they're from the same place, or maybe they just seem like they're on your wavelength. It's comfortable, right? You instantly feel like you belong, and you start connecting over shared experiences, inside jokes, and common ground. But have you ever noticed how, after a little while, it feels like there's a subtle, maybe even unconscious divide between your group and everyone else? You start to think that your group is better, or more interesting, or just more right than others. It's almost like you've found your team, and naturally, you start to judge others who aren't part of it. You might not even realize you're doing it, but this behavior, that's what psychologists call in-group bias. In-group bias is a tendency we all have to favor people who belong to the same group as we do. It's a bias that happens naturally. We feel connected to those who share our identity, and over time, this can make us think they're better or more deserving than others who don't share those same traits or affiliations. It's a little like when you feel a deep sense of pride for your country or school or sports team, and feel a slight, maybe even unconscious judgment toward those who support the opposing side. You've probably seen this in action when it comes to sports, especially during intense games. Think about it. When your team scores, you feel a burst of excitement and pride, and you might even look at the other team with a bit of disdain. It's all in the heat of the moment, of course, but the idea that your team is better can carry over to all sorts of situations, whether it's supporting your hometown, your favorite band, or even the group of friends you've known since childhood. There's something that makes you feel like your group is special in some way. Now you might be thinking, So what? Why does this matter? Well, it matters more than you might think. In-group bias affects how we make decisions and judgments. It can show up in all sorts of situations, from workplace dynamics to political debates, and even to the way we judge people we've just met. The more we feel connected to our group, the more we may find ourselves believing that people outside our group are somehow less worthy or less competent. This could affect how we treat others without even realizing it. Take a job interview, for example. You might feel an unconscious connection to someone who shares the same background, the same university, or even the same favorite hobbies. And without realizing it, that could give that person a slight edge in your mind, just because you share something in common. This bias can even make us overlook someone's qualifications or potential simply because they're not part of our group. In-group bias also shows up when we start to believe that the way our group does things is the best or the only right way to do things. This can make it harder for us to see different perspectives, and it can limit our ability to understand or empathize with people who think or act differently. It's why some people might refuse to acknowledge valid ideas from those outside their own circle, whether it's in the workplace, politics, or even something as simple as a family gathering. There's a famous study by a psychologist named Henry Tajfel that helps us understand how in-group bias works. In his experiment, Tajfel created two random groups of people. They didn't know each other before, and they didn't have any special reason to be grouped together. They were just divided based on a trivial thing, like which painting they liked more. But even with such a small distinction, Tajfel found that participants started favoring people in their own group. Even though the groups were completely arbitrary and meaningless, they were willing to give their own group better rewards just because they were in it. This experiment shows just how deeply rooted this bias is. It doesn't take much to trigger it. It's something that's hardwired into our brains, and it helps us bond with others, which, in the right context, can be a positive thing. But it also means we're more likely to create divisions between ourselves and others, often without realizing it. In our day-to-day lives, we might experience this in smaller, yet still significant ways. It could show up in a classroom, where students in the same study group start to look down on those in different groups, or in a social setting, when people who share the same hobby or interest naturally stick together, leaving others feeling excluded. Even on a larger scale, in political or social movements, people often end up in echo chambers where they only hear opinions that match their own, which can make it harder for them to consider opposing viewpoints. The key to overcoming in-group bias is awareness. Once we start recognizing this bias in ourselves, we can make an effort to push beyond it. It starts with being open-minded and curious about people who don't share our same views or interests. By learning to recognize the humanity in others, whether or not they belong to our group, we can break down these unnecessary divisions and see the world in a broader, more inclusive way. So the next time you find yourself in a group and start feeling that subtle pull to favor those around you, take a moment to reflect. Ask yourself, are you truly seeing everyone as equal? Or are you unconsciously letting your in-group bias cloud your judgment? Understanding this bias helps us be more empathetic, more open to new ideas, and more aware of how we can build connections that go beyond the groups we naturally gravitate to. You've probably been in a situation where you've watched a movie or TV show, and the last episode was so incredible that you couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe you even told your friends, that last episode was the best one ever, but what about the episodes before it? Were they really all that great? Or is it possible that your mind is just focused on the most recent, most exciting thing? This is a perfect example of something called recency bias, and it's something that affects all of us without us even realizing it. You might not always notice it, but recency bias can change how we remember things, how we make decisions, and even how we see the world around us. Recency bias happens when we place too much importance on the most recent information or experience we've encountered. We give it more weight than it actually deserves, just because it's fresh in our minds. It's like getting a new pair of shoes and thinking they're the best shoes ever, just because they're new, not because they're necessarily better than your old ones. The newest thing always seems to stand out, and that's exactly what recency bias does. Think about it. You've probably been asked to rate a product or service after an experience. Maybe it was at a restaurant or a hotel. How often do you base your entire rating on the last part of the experience? If your meal ended on a high note, like a delicious dessert, you might give a glowing review, even if the rest of the meal was just okay. But if the meal ended with a mistake, like a long wait for the check, your rating could drop, even if the rest of the experience was fine. It's not that we're intentionally skewing our opinion, it's just that the most recent part of the experience stands out the most. Recency bias doesn't just affect your reviews or ratings, it can also impact bigger decisions in life. For example, when you're deciding whether to stick with a job or look for a new one, you might focus on the most recent issue that happened at work. Maybe you had a tough meeting or felt underappreciated that day, and suddenly you're questioning if it's time to move on. But if you really think about it, the job has had both good and bad moments. That bad meeting doesn't necessarily represent the whole picture, but your brain might make it feel like it does. This bias can also sneak its way into our personal lives. Think about your memories. When you think back to a vacation or a party, do you remember the whole trip, or is it the last few moments that stick out the most? Maybe it was that final sunset or a last-minute conversation with friends that you replay in your head. The last few moments feel more vivid because they're fresh, but they might not be the most important part of the entire experience. Your brain just has a natural tendency to highlight the most recent events, and that's what recency bias is all about. So why does this matter? Well, recency bias affects the way we make judgments and decisions, and it can often lead us to make choices we later regret. For example, if you're choosing between two products and the most recent one you saw is better marketed or more impressive at first glance, you might lean toward buying it, even though the first product may be a better fit for you in the long run. It's not always the freshest idea that's the best one. It's just the one that's on your mind right now. One famous example of recency bias comes from the world of sports. If you've ever followed a team through a season, you might have noticed that fans often judge players or coaches based on their most recent performance. Let's say a star quarterback has an off game in the final week of the season, and suddenly people are questioning whether he should keep his starting position, even though he's been great for the whole year. Recency bias makes us forget the bigger picture, the games he won earlier in the season, and only focuses on that one bad performance at the end. It's not a fair way to judge someone, but it's how our brains work. So how can we fight recency bias? The key is awareness. Once you realize that your brain might be giving too much importance to the most recent information, you can start to pause and reflect before making big decisions. Think about the whole situation, not just the most recent part. Ask yourself if the latest event or experience is truly representative of the entire picture, or if it's just the thing that's freshest in your mind. It's also helpful to balance your judgment with other sources of information. If you're rating a product, try to look back at your entire experience with it, not just the last thing you remember. If you're making an important life decision, like a job change, consider the long-term patterns rather than focusing on a single moment of frustration or excitement. Recency bias is just one of the many ways our brains take shortcuts to help us make decisions. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can cause us to make judgments that are less thoughtful and less fair. By recognizing it, we can become more mindful of how our brains work and take steps to avoid letting the most recent event cloud our judgment. And who knows? Maybe next time you're rating a movie, you'll think twice before declaring it the best one ever, just because the last scene was so epic. So keep an eye out for recency bias, and remember to give every part of the experience the attention it deserves. Have you ever been on a losing streak in a game and then convinced yourself that your next move is bound to be a win? Maybe you flipped a coin 5 times and it landed on heads each time, so you thought, it's got to be tails next. Or you're sitting at a slot machine in a casino, thinking that after so many spins without a win, your luck is about to change. It feels like the odds are finally in your favor, right? Well, here's the catch: that thinking is an example of something called the gambler's fallacy, and it can lead us to make some pretty bad decisions. The gambler's fallacy is a belief that past events can influence the outcome of future events, when, in fact, they have no bearing on each other. It's a pattern of thinking that tricks us into believing that randomness has a memory. This might sound strange at first, but it happens all the time. People think that because something hasn't happened in a while, it's more likely to happen soon, or because something has happened too often, it's due to stop. In reality, these events are completely independent of each other. The reason this happens is simple. We're hardwired to look for patterns, even when there aren't any. Our brains are built to detect order in chaos, which helped our ancestors survive in the wild. But in modern life, that instinct can lead us astray, especially when we're dealing with chance or probability. The gambler's fallacy happens when we try to force an explanation on something that's actually completely random, like flipping a coin or playing a slot machine. Let's break it down with an example. Imagine you're at a casino, sitting at a roulette table. The ball has landed on red 7 times in a row. Now you might think to yourself, it's got to land on black next, right? The odds are too high for red to hit again. But here's the thing. Each spin of the roulette wheel is independent of the last one. The ball doesn't remember where it landed the last time. The odds are always the same, and red or black doesn't owe you anything. In fact, the probability of the ball landing on red or black stays the same each time, no matter how many times it's landed on one color before. Your belief that the ball is due to land on black is a classic example of the gambler's fallacy. Now, let's take a step back. Why does this bias matter? Well, the gambler's fallacy can influence the way we make decisions in other areas of life too. It's not just limited to casinos or games of chance. It shows up in situations where we're trying to predict the future based on past events, even when those past events are unrelated. Maybe you've been working hard on a project for days without seeing results, and you start thinking, it's been tough, so I'm bound to get a breakthrough soon. Or you keep trying the same strategy at work, assuming it's due to work just because it hasn't worked yet. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that the universe is keeping score and that things have to balance out. But reality doesn't work that way. In fact, the gambler's fallacy can lead to poor decisions because it can make you overestimate your chances of success, push you to gamble with your money or time, or even cause you to make decisions that are less likely to help you in the long run. To make this a bit more tangible, let's take a look at a real-life example from the world of sports. Back in the 2004 Olympics, a basketball team was facing a tough opponent. They were on a losing streak, but they kept telling themselves, we've been losing so much, we're bound to win soon. They relied on the gambler's fallacy to drive their confidence. However, no matter how much they believed their losing streak would end, the game's outcome was still based on skill, preparation, and teamwork, not on the idea that a win was due. The lesson here is that understanding the gambler's fallacy is crucial because it helps us recognize when we're falling into its trap. It teaches us to be more mindful of how we approach uncertainty and to avoid making decisions based on faulty assumptions about randomness. The next time you feel like you're due for a win, whether it's in a game, work, or any other area of life, try to pause and ask yourself, am I really making this decision based on logic, or am I just hoping for something to happen because I think it's supposed to? So, while the gambler's fallacy can make you believe in patterns that don't exist, knowing about it can help you make smarter, more rational decisions. And if you ever find yourself in a casino, you can remember that the wheel has no memory. It doesn't care about your losing streak, and your next spin is as unpredictable as the one before it. You might not be able to control randomness, but understanding it is the first step in avoiding the pitfalls of this sneaky cognitive bias. We all have that one friend who just seems to have it all together, right? They're always dressed perfectly, have that charming smile, and seem to light up every room they walk into. You might find yourself thinking, wow, this person is amazing. They must be super smart, successful, and nice. But here's the kicker. What if that person isn't as perfect as they seem? What if they're just really good at giving off the right vibe? This is where something called the halo effect comes in. It's a bias that tricks our brain into making big judgments about a person based on just one small thing we like about them. Maybe you think that because they're well dressed, they must also be great at their job, or because they're friendly, they must be really good at managing their finances. It's all linked to the halo effect, and it happens more often than we realize. Now, let's break it down. The halo effect is a psychological bias where our overall impression of someone, usually based on one positive trait, shapes our entire view of them. So if someone is attractive, we might think they're also smart, kind, and capable, even though we have no evidence of those qualities. It's like when we see a person in a movie role that we love, and suddenly we assume they're exactly like their character. But the truth is, we're not really seeing the person for who they truly are. We're just seeing them through a halo, a golden glow that makes everything else seem better than it might actually be. Here's the thing. The halo effect is sneaky. Most of us don't realize we're falling for it. It's easy to get caught up in someone's good looks, their charisma, or even their status and assume they have it all together. We do it with celebrities, bosses, and even our friends and family. But the problem is, this bias can cloud our judgment, making it harder to make fair and accurate decisions. It can lead to us believing that someone is a genius because they look the part or assume they're trustworthy just because they're charming. Understanding the halo effect matters because it impacts so many of our daily decisions. Think about how we choose leaders or employees, or even how we pick who to hang out with. When we give too much credit to one trait, we might miss out on the bigger picture. Maybe you've experienced this when someone with a great smile gets away with more mistakes than others, simply because we've already decided they're the good one. Or maybe you've made a snap judgment about someone who doesn't fit your idea of success, only to later realize that you were completely wrong. The halo effect also shows up in consumer behavior. When companies advertise their products, they often try to associate their brand with positive qualities. Ever noticed how a luxury car commercial features beautiful people having fun in stunning locations? They're using the halo effect to make you think, if I drive this car, I'll be happy and successful too. The same goes for endorsements by celebrities. If you like the celebrity, there's a good chance you'll associate their positive traits with the product they're promoting, even though the two may have nothing to do with each other. One of the best-known examples of the halo effect in action comes from a classic study in psychology. A researcher named Edward Thorndike conducted an experiment with military officers. He found that when officers were rated positively for one characteristic, like being good-looking or having a pleasant personality, they were also rated higher in other areas, such as leadership abilities and intelligence. Even though there was no direct connection between looks and leadership, the officer's overall positive impression colored every other judgment. This is a perfect example of how our brains automatically make these sweeping judgments, often without realizing it. So why is this so important to understand? Well, the halo effect influences not just how we view other people, but how we make decisions about hiring, promotions, friendships, and even who we trust. If we don't recognize when we're being influenced by a single trait, we can end up giving someone a lot more credit than they deserve. Or worse, we might judge them unfairly based on one thing we dislike about them. It's not just a harmless mistake. It can lead to biases that shape our work, our social circles, and even our personal lives. The best way to counteract the halo effect is to slow down and take a step back before making judgments. Try to look at the full picture, not just the shiny part. Get to know the person better, or evaluate a situation based on facts rather than gut feelings. It's tough because the halo effect happens so naturally, but by recognizing it, we can start to make more balanced decisions and avoid letting one glowing trait cloud everything else. Remember that first impressions aren't always the full story. It's easy to get caught up in someone's appearance, charm, or success. But if we want to be fair and make better decisions, we need to see people and situations for all that they are, not just the glowing bits. So the next time you meet someone new, try to keep that halo in check. Who knows? You might be surprised by what you find when you look beyond the shine. You've probably seen it before, right? Someone loses their job or falls into some kind of misfortune. And there's always that one person who says, well, they must have done something to deserve it. They might not say it outright, but you can feel the judgment. The idea that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people seems so ingrained in our thinking that it's almost like it's a law of the universe. But is it really that simple? Is life really that fair? This belief is actually part of something called the just world hypothesis. It's a psychological bias that makes us think that the world is a fair place where everyone gets what they deserve. And if something bad happens to someone, it must be because they somehow brought it on themselves. It sounds reasonable, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to believe that life is fair? But this belief can actually lead us to make judgments that are a little, well, off. Think about it. Have you ever heard someone say, well, they must have made bad choices to end up in that situation? We tend to believe that people who experience hardship must have done something wrong, and this thought process can sometimes make us blind to the bigger picture. We forget that bad things happen to good people all the time, and sometimes life isn't just about being good or bad. So why is this a problem? It's because the just world hypothesis can make us oversimplify situations and ignore real-world factors like luck, privilege, or circumstances beyond someone's control. Imagine if someone is struggling with homelessness or poverty. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking, oh, they just didn't work hard enough, without realizing that there could be all sorts of reasons behind their situation, such as job loss, family issues, or even discrimination. But because of this bias, we tend to assume they must have deserved it. This belief isn't just about big societal issues either. It affects our day-to-day thinking. When we see someone succeed, it's easy to think, well, they must have worked harder or made better decisions than everyone else. But sometimes, luck, timing, or connections play a huge role. And when people face setbacks, we might automatically assume they didn't try hard enough or made bad choices without understanding the full context. Understanding the just world hypothesis matters because it shapes how we interact with others and how we perceive the world. It affects how we judge people, how we feel about things like justice, and how we make decisions about our own lives. If we believe that everyone gets what they deserve, we might be more likely to dismiss the challenges that others face and not offer the help they might need. It can make us less empathetic and more judgmental. It's a pretty sneaky bias, and it's something we all experience, often without realizing it. Let's take a look at a famous example from the world of psychology. There's a study that was done in the 1960s by a psychologist named Melvin Lerner. He conducted an experiment where participants watched someone else get shocked as part of a study on learning. The shocks were obviously uncomfortable, but they were part of a controlled experiment. However, when the participants saw that the person getting shocked was suffering, they started to rationalize it by saying things like, well, they must have done something to deserve it. Maybe they didn't try hard enough or weren't paying attention. Even though the person being shocked had no control over the situation, the participants still believed that the suffering was somehow deserved. This is a textbook example of the just world hypothesis in action. This bias doesn't just show up in experiments though, it's all around us. Think about the way people react to stories of celebrities or influencers facing scandals. Often the response is, well, they asked for it, or they must have made bad choices to end up like this. This idea that everyone deserves what happens to them, whether good or bad, is all over social media, news, and even in casual conversations. It's a mindset that has been embedded in our culture, whether we realize it or not. But here's the twist. The just world hypothesis doesn't actually reflect the reality of life. The truth is that life is messy, unfair, and unpredictable. People don't always get what they deserve, and sometimes bad things happen to the best of us. The important thing is recognizing when we're falling into this bias and questioning whether we're oversimplifying someone else's situation. It's about being more compassionate and understanding that we don't always know what someone else is going through. So, the next time you catch yourself thinking, well, they must have deserved it, try to step back and ask yourself, what's the full story here? Are there other factors at play? Understanding the just world hypothesis can help us be more empathetic, more open-minded, and less quick to judge others based on a biased sense of what's deserved. The world doesn't always give us what we think we deserve, but that doesn't mean we should stop striving for fairness and justice. It just means we need to approach the world with a little more understanding and a little less certainty that everything is always fair. Life's a bit more complicated than that, and that's okay. Have you ever scrolled through social media, seen someone your age living in a mansion, driving a fancy car, or running $1 billion startup from their laptop, and thought, why isn't that me? Maybe you've even bought their online course, followed their 10-step blueprint to success, or tried to copy their daily routine, down to the green smoothies and 4 a.m. wake-up calls. But here's the thing. What if I told you that focusing only on those people, the ones shouting about their wins, might actually be setting you up to fail? Let's talk about something we've all done. Imagine you're trying to learn how to bake the perfect cake. You watch a video of a chef pulling a fluffy, golden masterpiece out of the oven. Easy, you think. You follow their recipe exactly. Same ingredients, same oven temperature, same whisking technique. But when you open the oven, it's a sad, sunken mess. Now you're frustrated. What did I do wrong? But here's the kicker. The chef never showed you their first 10 cakes. The lumpy ones, the burnt ones, the ones that looked like hockey pucks. You only saw the one that worked. This is exactly what happens when we fall into the trap of survivorship bias, our brain's sneaky habit of paying attention to the survivors, the successes, the winners, the visible results, and completely ignoring the invisible failures that didn't make it. It's like walking into a library and only reading the happy endings, then assuming every story turns out that way. We do this all the time. Whether we're picking stocks, starting a business, or even choosing a college major, we see the glowing success stories and think, if I just do what they did, I'll get the same result. But we're missing half the picture. So what is survivorship bias exactly? Think of it as a spotlight. Imagine you're in a dark room, and that spotlight shines on a handful of people who've achieved something amazing. The best-selling authors, the viral influencers, the lottery winners. But outside that spotlight, a huge crowd of people you never hear about. The authors with unpublished manuscripts, the influencers with 3 followers, the thousands who bought lottery tickets and won nothing. Survivorship bias tricks us into staring at the spotlight and forgetting the rest of the room exists. It's not that the successes aren't real, it's that they're not the whole story. Why does this matter? Well, survivorship bias can lead us to make some really bad decisions. Let's say you want to start a YouTube channel. You watch a video titled, "How I Got 1 million subscribers in 6 months, and think, all I need to do is post daily and use these hashtags. But you don't see the 99% of creators who posted daily, used those same hashtags, and got 0 traction. Or imagine you're a parent pushing your kid to become a pro athlete because you read about a superstar who trained 6 hours a day as a child. But what about the millions of kids who trained just as hard and never went pro? Survivorship bias makes us confuse correlation with causation, assuming that because something worked for a visible few, it'll work for everyone. Here's a classic example from history. During World War II, the US military wanted to reinforce their bombers to survive enemy fire. They studied planes returning from missions and noted where the bullet holes were clustered on the wings, tail, and body. The obvious conclusion? Let's armor those areas. But a mathematician named Abraham Wald disagreed. He pointed out a critical flaw. They were only looking at planes that survived. The bullet holes in those areas didn't take down the plane, which meant the missing bullet holes, the engines, cockpit, etc., were the real vulnerabilities. The military had fallen into survivorship bias. Armoring the unharmed parts of returning planes saved countless lives. So how do we avoid this trap? First, get curious about the invisible data. If someone's selling you a success story, ask, who else tried this and failed? What's the full picture? Second, embrace the power of and. Yes, hard work matters, and luck, timing, and unseen advantages often play a role. Finally, give yourself grace. Just because your journey doesn't look like someone else's highlight reel doesn't mean you're failing. You might just be missing the context. Next time you see an overnight success, remember, that person might have been grinding for a decade. That viral video might have been their 100th upload. And for every CEO dropping wisdom on a podcast, there are 10 others who took the same risks and lost. Survivorship bias isn't about dismissing success. It's about seeing the whole story. So keep aiming high, but keep your eyes open. The road to success isn't a straight line. It's a crowded, messy highway, and every driver's story matters.